We continue in Hebrews 4, verse 1 and 2, and this is really continuing on what we spoke about last time, and it's the theme here is entering into God's rest, and this is a massively important subject, as we will see, also for us Christians, not just for the Hebrews, the Jews. So, verse 1, it says, "Let us therefore fear, lest a promise being left us of entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short of it. For unto us was the gospel preached, as well as unto them, but the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it." So, it begins with therefore, and we've seen this repeatedly throughout these first chapters of the book of Hebrews, and it will continue. It's all the time pointing back to what has been said. Therefore. It's a continuous flow. It's not separate chapters that we can completely take apart. So we always have to keep in mind the whole context. So it continues on what is written in chapter 3, how the people that were led out of Egypt did not enter the promised land because of unbelief. But the promise, it's the promised land, the promise still stands, and we can enter into that rest. So, and the reader here is warned not to make the same mistake as the Israelites did back then. The mistake of unbelief, the sin of unbelief even, as we saw last time. So, what is God's rest? One might ask. It's not obviously literally the promised land. It's something else. Well, you can describe it in many ways or give it many attributes. Entering God's rest means having peace with God. It means freedom of the bondage of sin. It means deliverance of the burden of the law. It means deliverance of the burden of this world. And the list actually goes on. So there are many things that we can fill in and actually also back with scriptures. Now Paul uses here in verse 1 the term "come short," lest any of you should come short of it. Now this "come short" is an expression that was used in Greek games, races, to describe the one who was behind the winner. And of course today if you watch an athletics race or any race, you'll see there is electronic measurement to see who passes the finish first and to give the exact time in tenths of hundreds of seconds even. And the difference is sometimes minimal between the first and the second. But no matter how small the difference is, the one that is second lost, so to speak. The other is the winner. The one that comes after him, he comes short. He lost the game. So what does it mean? It is not enough to almost enter his rest. You don't want to come short of it. That is what he's saying. Even if it's almost, it's not enough. It's not enough to leave Egypt. You also want to enter the promised land. How? How do we enter God's rest? Well, verse 2 tells us that one needs to hear the gospel. For unto us the gospel was preached. But hearing the gospel is not enough. As it says, the Israelites had heard it, but it didn't profit them, it says. And why? Because they did not receive it with faith, because of their unbelief. It was not mixed with faith, as it says here. One may hear God's word and have spiritual experiences, but if it is not mixed with faith, it will do no good. Think of the Israelites, how great their joy was when they left Egypt. They had stayed up that night before, they had eaten the lamb, had put the blood on the doorpost, and seen all these miracles, the plagues that God actually brought upon the Egyptians. But they were also great miracles. And then they left and they went through the Red Sea. And we read, of course, in the book of Exodus that when they were on the other side and after the Egyptians were crushed and cut off, they were singing and dancing and praising God. There was great joy, great joy. Yet all of them perished in the wilderness. Such a wonderful promise, but they came short. Why? Because it was not mixed with faith. And they lost the game. Now, unfortunately, this is the fate of many, and I dare to say most Christians. It's not a matter of us pointing to the Jews and their mistake and thinking how great we are. We are in danger of the exact same error, and that's also why Paul is here warning the reader of the book of Hebrews for that. But he says it also very clear in Romans 11, verses 19 through 21, where it says, Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off, that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief, they were broken off. And thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed, lest he also spare not thee. And he's not speaking here to the Hebrews. He's speaking, as you can read in Romans chapter 1 and verse 7, he's speaking to the saints in Rome. So again, it's a very serious warning. We continue then in Hebrews 4, verses 3 through 5. For we which have believed do enter into rest. As he said, as I have sworn in my wrath, if they shall enter into my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he spake in a certain place of the seventh day on this wise, and God did rest the seventh day from all his works, and in this place again, if they shall enter into my rest. So before it spoke about those who did not believe and who did not enter in his rest. Now, in contrast, it speaks about us, it says, who have believed and do enter into his rest. Unbelief keeps people out of God's rest, but faith guides God's people into his rest. God's people, that is in Hebrew Yahudim, from which we get the word Jew. This is what it means, God's people. Notice also that it says my rest, both in verse 3 and in verse 5 it says my rest. And this is a direct quote from Psalm 95. Let's read that also, verse 11, Psalm 95. There it says, unto whom I swear in my wrath that they should not enter into my rest. So it clearly declares that it is God's rest, it's his rest. And then the origin of this rest is also given in Hebrews 4. It is after God finished from all his works, that were, by the way, finished before the foundation of this world. That is when he entered into his rest. And that, of course, has its origin in Genesis 2, verse 2, where it says, and on the seventh day God ended his work which he had made, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. Now it says, by the way, as a side note, in verse 4, he spake in a certain place. And we find a similar wording elsewhere in the book of Hebrews and in other places also, by the way, in the New Testament. It is written, or somewhere it says, in a certain place, and that is because in those days there was not clear, or actually there was no, there were no chapters and verses and all these things in the scriptures. So it was sometimes difficult to refer to a specific passage. So you see sometimes as written in Isaiah, or the Psalms speak, or David wrote. So unfortunately we can now trace back everything exactly. Okay, that's just a side note. So we know now how to enter in God's rest, and roughly we understand what it is. And we also see here the origin of it, and that it is something that has been written in the Psalms, in Psalm 95, and that's important. I'll get back to that in a minute. But first I want to read the following verses in Hebrews 4, verses 6 through 9. There it says, "Seeing therefore it remaineth that some must enter therein, and they to whom it was first preached entered not in, because of unbelief. Again he limited a certain day, saying in David, Today, after so a long time, as it is said, Today, if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts. For if Jesus had given them rest, then would he not afterward have spoken of another day? There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God." Now, God's plan did not fail, because Israel, to whom it was first preached, to whom the gospel was first preached, because they had entered not into his rest due to unbelief. That doesn't mean God's plan failed. No. It's made clear here, Psalm 95, saying in David, it's declared here, but we know that's Psalm 95, says, Today. And that was therefore written by David. Now David came way after the Exodus and after they entered the Promised Land. So if it had been fulfilled when they entered the Promised Land under Joshua, then that psalm would have made no sense. Now it says here in verse 8, "For if Jesus had given them rest," and that is the King James rendering. It's very confusing because you think of Jesus, the Messiah, but it's not speaking about that Jesus. It's speaking actually about Joshua. So you find in other translations it may say Joshua. It's referring to Joshua. Now there is a reason why you could also say Jesus, but what is meant directly and literally is Joshua. Joshua, or Yehoshua in Hebrew, this name, Yahoshua, is peace, or salvation, I should say. Salvation from God, or God's salvation, or God saves. Yehoshua is Joshua, but it's also the same word as where we get Yeshua. It's just a shorter, abbreviated form of the same word. So Joshua and Jesus is actually, in Hebrew, it's one and the same name. However, we have translated it in different names, and so technically it's not wrong that it says here Jesus, but it's confusing. It would have been more clear if it had said Joshua, since in the book of Joshua it's also called Joshua and not Jesus. Anyway, that is meant because he means to say the Israelites perished in the wilderness, and then the next generation under the guidance of Joshua, they entered the Promised Land. If that would have fulfilled the entering into God's rest, then it's done. But now he says, after that, David wrote his psalm. So I put this in this timeline just to for clarity. So we have the Exodus. That's used here as a reference and as also a reminder, because it's the most important event in the history of Israel. and all the Jews know this story very well, and they know Moses, which they regard as the greatest man ever. So it's a good example. The Exodus, and then you see there is 40 years in the wilderness, 40 years of unbelief, because of which they perished there in the wilderness. Then there is Joshua, and they entered into his rest as a type, I should say. They entered the promised land. That does not mean that all these people entered into God's rest in a spiritual sense, but the type is there shown that through Joshua they entered into the rest. Now then later, David writes this psalm, Psalm 95, and he says that it still remains. He speaks about today. If you hear his voice, don't harden your heart. Which, by the way, we find this quote of Psalm 95 here in Hebrews 4. We have also seen it in chapter 2, in verses 8 and verses 15. So this is the third time that this particular verse is quoted here. Therefore it's very important. So David says it remains. Then comes Jesus, also Joshua. And just as with the first Joshua, they entered into his rest as a type, literal, into the promised land. Through Jesus, the second Joshua, if you will, we can enter into God's rest in the spiritual sense, in the true sense. And it is literally what he says also in Matthew 11, verse 29, when he says, "Take my yoke upon you." He says then, "And you shall find rest for your souls." And then we have this period that we are in now, the church age, or the age of grace, which is also a period of 40, just like the trek in the wilderness, but it's 40 jubilees, 2,000 years. And there is again lots of unbelief. And in this period, Paul writes this epistle to the Hebrews, but by extension to all believers. He says, just as David did, he says it remains. It's still there. He quotes 3 times this verse, "Today, if you hear his voice, harden not your hearts." It is just as valid today in 2023 as it was when Paul wrote this. It still remains, and it remains until the end of the age. That is what is being explained here in this part of the book of Hebrews. So from the prior list that I mentioned of what God's rest is, list that's not complete, but it gives a good idea. And also from what is written here, it must be clear that God's rest is in a person. It's in a person. It's not in doctrines, it's not in works, it's not in the law, it's not in philosophies. God's rest can only be found in Jesus. Only in Jesus. As was foreshadowed by Joshua leading the people into the promised land, Jesus, the second Joshua, leads us into God's rest. And it's a beautiful typology if you take it apart. So, we continue in verse 10. "For he that is entered into his rest, he also hath ceased from his own works, as God did from his." So, tying back to the origin of this term, entering into his rest, that we read from Genesis 2, God finished his work and entered into his rest. So should we also cease our works, which does not mean that we are not allowed to do good works. Of course we are allowed, but it means we cannot work our way into God's rest. We must surrender, not work, but surrender. God rested from his work on the original Sabbath because the work was finished. And it was very good. So likewise we must cease from self-justifying works because Jesus has finished the work on the cross. Verse 11. "Let us labor therefore to enter into that rest, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. So, as we see here in the book of Hebrews, it comes sort of in waves of pointing to the scriptures, pointing to history, explaining the meaning of what has happened there, what is described there, and then giving direction, and then saying, okay, now it's time for you to choose, to do something with this information. And he does the same here. Now let us labor to enter into that rest. Again, the words used here in the King James might be confusing, because he just said God ceased from his work, and we should also not try to work our way into God's rest. It doesn't go that way. And then he says, let us labor. And labor, you think again of work, but that's actually not what it's meant here. The original word has more the idea of strive. Let us strive to enter into that rest. It's not literal work that we do. But we have to get going, to do something, to make this choice, to make this step, and to give heed, to enter in faith. Active faith, this is what we need to exercise. And so, when we see the Israelites entering the promised land under Joshua, it required faith. It required faith to do so, because in the land there were giants, and they knew this, but they knew God was with them. The first thing they faced after crossing the Jordan were the massive walls of Jericho, and it took faith to just march around that city and trust that God would do his work. If we do not have faith, and that's what it says here in the second half of this verse, lest any man fall, same way as the example, fall by unbelief. We must walk in faith, otherwise we will fall and perish. King David is another example of this. At the very beginning of his adulthood, he was actually still a teenager. He faced a giant, and he faced him in faith. He ran toward him in faith. I speak, of course, about Goliath. And so, in light of all this, we go back to the first verse, the beginning of this chapter, where it says, let us therefore fear. Fear of God is the beginning of all wisdom. Let us therefore fear. Let us never harden our hearts, and let us cease our own works, and diligently walk in faith to enter into that rest. Amen.